Hello everybody, I am Miss Sophie. I'd like to welcome you to my English grammar video course. Let's start then. Today we're going to see the simple present tense, the affirmative form. The structure is the subject plus the verb infinitive plus the rest of the sentence. Remember that we have to add s or es to the verb infinitive in the third person singular. He, she, it. For example, I work in an office, you work in an office, but for he, she, it, we have to say he works in an office, she works in an office, or it works in an office. Most verbs add s. For example, work, works, drive, drives, run, runs. But verbs normally add es when they end in o, do, does, for example, and when they end in s, x, ch, and sh, we have to add es and we have to pronounce is. For example, mix, mixes, miss, misses, catch, catches, push, pushes. Now we're going to see the uses of the simple present tense. We use it for permanent truths, for the present period, for habitual actions, for future reference, observations and declarations, and for making suggestions. Let's see the first use of the simple present tense, for permanent truths. We use the simple present tense for statements that are always true. Summer follows spring. The earth goes around the sun. The sun rises in the west. Another use of the simple present tense is the present period. We use the simple present tense to refer to events, actions, situations that are true in the present period of time or may continue indefinitely. For example, my father works in a bank. My sister wears glasses. Remember to add the s to the third person singular. He, she, it. Another use of the simple present tense is habitual actions. We commonly use the simple present tense to ask and answer questions which begin with how often. How often do you go to the dentist? I go every 6 months. How often does Sue visit her parents? She visits her parents every day. We also use the simple present tense to describe habitual actions, things that happen repeatedly. I get up at 7 o'clock every day, for example. Future reference. When we refer to timetables or programs or events in a calendar, the concert begins at 7:30 and ends at 9:30. The plane leaves at 11 and arrives at 3. Do not forget to add the s to the verb form in the third person singular. In these cases, for example, the concert begins, ends, the plane leaves, the plane arrives. We always add s or es to he, she, it. For observations and declarations, with stative verbs and other verbs to make declarations and observations. Stative verbs are like, love, think, understand, prefer, want, hear, see, appear, seem, belong, own, etc. For example, I love you. He hates me. We live in difficult times. We cannot say, I'm loving you, he's hating me, we're living. We use the simple present tense with these stative verbs. For making suggestions, for example, why don't we go to the beach today? The meaning is, let's go to the beach. We use why don't we or why don't I. Let's now see the negative form of the simple present tense. The structure is the subject plus the auxiliary do or does plus not plus the verb infinitive plus the rest of the sentence. The auxiliary do plus not, whose contracted form is don't, is used for I, you, we, and they. The auxiliary does plus not, whose contracted form is doesn't, is used for he, she, and it. Let's now see some examples of how we use a negative form of the simple present tense. I do not work in an office. You do not work in an office. And remember, for he, she, it, we use does. So, for example, he does not work in an office. Let's now see the interrogative form of the simple present tense for yes-no questions. The structure is the auxiliary do or does plus the subject plus the verb plus the rest of the sentence and the question mark. Remember, the auxiliary do is for I, you, we, and they, and the auxiliary does for he, she, it. Let's see some examples of yes-no questions. Do I work in an office? Do you work in an office? Does he work in an office? Pay special attention to the intonation. You expect an answer which is yes or no. So the intonation has to be a rising intonation. Listen to this. Does he work in an office? The answer could be yes, he does. You should not say, does he work in an office? Or do you work in an office? Because you expect an answer. So you have to say, does he work in an office? Do you work in an office? Do they work in an office? The answer will be yes or no. The answers for the yes-no questions are short answers, yes or no. The structure is yes plus a subject plus do or does. For example, yes, I do. Yes, he does. Or yes, we do. And for no are no plus a subject plus do or does plus not. No, I don't. No, he doesn't. No, we don't. There is another type of questions called WH questions. They are formed with the WH word plus the auxiliary do or does plus a subject plus the verb infinitive and the rest of the sentence. WH words could be what, where, when, why, how, etc. For example, where do you live? What does she like? When do they go to school? You should remember that the main verb in the interrogative form stays in the infinitive form. So we say, where do I work? Where do you work? Where does he work? Another important point here is to know that the intonation has to be a falling intonation. So you should say, where does he work? Or where do we work? And you shouldn't say, where do we work? Where do they work? That is for yes-no questions. In yes-no questions, we use rising intonation. For example, do you work in a bank? Yes or no? And in these questions, in the WH word questions, we use a falling intonation. Where do we work? Where do they work? Let's practice. Put the verb in the correct form. Let's see the answers. The bank opens at 9 and closes at 3 every day. I have a car, but I do not use it very often. You can also say, don't use it. How many cigarettes do you smoke a day? What do you do? I'm an engineer. For example, here, do, the first do is the auxiliary, and the second do is the main verb.